I think today I need to start by setting the context. It's unusual for a speaker to come into a situation like this. And I think it'd be inappropriate rather to move into any kind of motivation, inspiration, or even transformation without acknowledging the current situation every single one of us on the planet find ourselves in, and here in EGM. And so let's start with this word unprecedented. And you've heard this used a lot by newscasters around the world, that we are in unprecedented times. Unprecedented means never happened before. Now that's not quite true. It might have never happened before in living memory, but we go back to the 1918 flu epidemic, which is erroneously called the Spanish flu. And we saw the same scenario. So it's not like we cannot turn to history and see what potential outcomes are for this. Over the last month, I've been coaching senior leaders, CEOs, who've been going through the stages of grief, from anger and bargaining before they've can get to acceptance. CEOs who, in January, I did their company kickoff, and we had goals and aspirations for the year. And now you have to move into grief because you're not going to hit those targets, certainly not in the first 2 or 3 quarters. And so there's this huge sense of loss just around the fact that most of us on this call are leaders, are target orientated, we're driven to achieve, to go for goals, and now we cannot. And the coaching that I've had to do, or am doing, is pivoting less to the future and more to how do we deal with the present? How do we deal on a day-to-day basis with the challenges that we're facing? So let me introduce you to the concept of self-leadership. I have been writing, researching, and speaking on the topic of self-leadership for over 20 years. And in 2012, I published a book with Dr. Anna Kazan, and we defined self-leadership as the practice of intentionally influencing your thinking, feeling, and actions to achieve your objectives. Now let's just deconstruct that a little bit. It's a practice. Like taking a shower is a practice. We need to do it on a daily basis, even if we're working from home, right? It is a practice, right? Staying clean is not permanent. The great Zig Ziglar said that taking a shower is like motivation, or motivation is like taking a shower. The effect is not permanent. So we need to practice self-leadership. I'm a self-leadership coach, sometimes called a self-leadership guru. Do I have to practice it? Yes. In these dark days that we've been experiencing, I've had to deal with my own self-awareness and my dark side, and feelings of frustration and anger myself. And it's a practice of influencing our thinking and feeling. Notice it doesn't say controlling our thinking and feeling, right? We think, we feel, and sometimes we're an observer of our thoughts and our emotions. Our emotions often have us. And as an observer as our emotions, we can ask ourselves the question, is this useful? Is this supporting me? Is being depressed or angry, is it supporting me to be in the best state I need to be to deal with what I need to deal with today? So we practice influencing what we're thinking, influencing our emotions to achieve our objectives. Now, in the current scenario, I think our objectives are very different. I think we have to have an objective not to self-sabotage. Right? Our own anger and frustration, if we share that as leaders to our families, to our colleagues, to our employees, we are doing nobody a favor. Panic spreads faster than the virus. So in this time, more than ever, it is my belief that self-leadership is essential. And that's why I think this is a timely presentation. When I first spoke with Nick, we spoke about me talking about self-leadership and digital disruption, because we are facing a huge crisis in terms of how we handle AI, machine learning. But I've adjusted this talk speech session to work through the fact that you need to be a self-leader in times of crisis and stop the self-sabotage. Now, as I said, we are all human beings and we're going to face these. very senior leaders that I coach are struggling, are really having to face their own inner demons around this. And so I think a maxim that I have been speaking about for as long as I can remember is that you can't lead others unless you first lead yourself. I think you would agree with me on that. I hope you would agree with me on that. And that the first place to look is in the mirror, right? It's easy to complain about everybody else, but the first place that we can influence, of course, is our own attitude. When I was a young man, I read Man's Search for Meaning by Dr. Viktor Frankl, who was an intern of a Nazi prisoner of war camp. He was destined for death as a Jew. And he realized that the last of all human freedoms is the freedom to choose our own attitude. And so before we lead others, we need to lead ourselves. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to shift to slide share, and you should be able to see my slides here. And I want to take you through some aspects of self-leadership and executive presence as it pertains to our current scenario. So let's look at a self-leadership model. This is from my 2016 book, the one that became an Amazon bestseller, and I'm going to make that available to you as a PDF at the end of this presentation. I have an offer for you on that to make that almost free. And so you'll see this model, and you'll see that there's an inner game and an outer game. The inner game is our intentionality to influence ourselves. And the outer game is how we influence others and impact towards the targets that we set. And you'll see that there's three cogs to the inner game: our self-awareness. And self-awareness is directly correlated with effective leadership. Effective leaders have high self-awareness. Now, a lack of self-awareness is often or is correlated with levels of narcissism. Now, narcissism, like all psychological disorders, is a scale, and we're all a little bit on the scale. We all have a little bit of narcissism. Typically, if we reach a leadership position, we have a little bit more than most. But if you have high narcissistic tendencies, you have low self-awareness and have a difficulty in adjusting to an external world that doesn't meet your internal world. So self-leaders have high self-awareness. Good leaders have high self-awareness. Self-confidence is very important. We have to be confident in our abilities, and that's based on our past and our current abilities. As opposed to the third cog, which is self-efficacy. And this is the most important thing. You see, none of us can confidently say we've been through this before. We might have been through SARS. We might have been through business disruption. I've been through the global financial crisis. I've been through a divorce. I've been through life-threatening health issues. There's a number of things that have given me confidence that I have the resilience to get through this. But what we all need right now is self-efficacy, the self-belief that we will get through this, that whatever happens, we will be able to make the adjustments and get through this. When we have a good inner game, then that influences our outer game. And this is why you can't lead others unless you first lead yourself. Now, the interesting thing here is that the self-leader is, because they have self-awareness, is constantly closing the gap between their actions and the goal. Now, around Feed Forward, I have an acronym that's easy to remember. It's 3 A's: accept, adjust, and advance. And as I talked about the stages of grief, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote extensively about this. We start with denial and bargaining and anger, but eventually with grief, we reach acceptance that what has happened has happened. And as leaders going through this crisis, the sooner we can accept the reality of the new normal, the quicker we can adjust our behaviors and our communications so we can again advance towards our objectives. Does that make sense? Accept, adjust, advance. And so you can have some self-awareness where you are on this model right now, because you all know whether you've been having those issues. So, as I previously said, you can't lead others unless you first lead yourself.